This is a short video demonstration of a utility called switch. Switch is a JSON preprocessor. That's about the best way I can describe it. It's got a fairly specific use case. It's designed for Morpheus and specifically for use with Morpheus option lists. So what is the issue? What is switch designed to do? Okay, well, in Morpheus, obviously there are workflows, tasks are powered by inputs, and those inputs have data which come from many sources. But some sources can be dynamic external sources. So for example, REST. So we have a contrived example here. We wouldn't do anything with donuts in Morpheus, but it's simple to demonstrate and ignore the data. Which uses an external data source. We're hosting it locally for this demo, but it could be any URL on the internet. But in order for us to use that data source, Morpheus requires the data to be parsed into name and value keys. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward, that a select control, which is how this data presents, it can be a look ahead as well, I believe, but it presents this way, requires name and value keys for the HTML control ultimately. So this data, I can show you what it looks like. Just have it here. This is the data file, the JSON data file, and this array here, the batter piece, is what we want to use in our control. Key pairs within an array. But in order to actually extract that data and use that in Morpheus in our select box, we actually need to write what's called a translation script. And those translation scripts can be a little complex, and they do require that you have an understanding of the JavaScript object model and indeed array model. For example, this is a translation script that's required to parse the data we've just seen into name and value pairs for use within this option list. And it's not straightforward. It's not impossible to write this, of course, but it does involve some trial and error, and I found that. I have some experience of JavaScript, not a lot, but it took some time and trial and error to actually hit the point in the file that I needed to iterate through that data and extract it. But you can see what I'm doing here is, once I know where the data is, I'm iterating through it all, and I'm assigning one element of that object type, in this case, to name, and a second element, ID, to the value. And those two things are what make up a select control with the options inside of it. So we don't need to save that, but suffice to say that isn't straightforward, and some people struggle with that. And if you're doing that for every file, it can be trial and error, as I say. So let's move on to what switch does. Now, switch is, I've already installed it. It's dead straightforward to get running on an appliance. In this case, I've got it on my Morpheus virtual machine, but you could host it anywhere you wanted to. It's a Go binary, so it cross compiles, I think, at the moment to Mac and Linux, so it's easy enough to get running. But what I want to draw your attention to here is this file here, sources. This is the configuration file, and every source that we want to extract or fetch from the internet has to go in this file. So basically, switch will fetch the data, and it will then parse out the data to the name value keys that we want, as we can see here. So we've got the name key, we're saying we want to extract type, and value we want to extract ID. But all of that sits nested some way down that file in arrays and other objects. So we give it the root key, the parent key if you like, to tell it where this data sits, and it will just go and find it and parse it out to a file. The TTL option allows us to select a expiry, a refresh for this data, so that switch will run in the background and automatically on interval check the expiries, check what the time to lives have expired, and go and fetch the file again. So it'll refresh the data for you. In this case, we've got a TTL set of 5 minutes. And every time we grab the data, in our case, we're going to serve it down to this location, where I also have de jure running, which is a hot reload JSON and CSV server. Again, there's videos about that. I'm not going to go into that here. And we're going to save it down as a file donut. So let's just run that. And I think I'm just going to do this because it could be some way back. There we go. So it's running. You can see it's basically gone and got the file, processed that file. So what we should have now, if we go back to the de jure server, let's just have a look at the data sources that we have available. Okay, so we've got two. So this was the one we were looking at earlier, the complicated one. And this is the one that's just been saved down, the donut file, and it serves at the endpoint donut. So let's just see what is there. Okay, so it's the same data, but it's been converted to name and value keys automatically for us. And because it sits at the root, there's no translation script required for Morpheus in order to parse this out. And what I hope to do is show you that now. So we will convert the option list that we have running here, or rather we'll create a new one, and then we'll change the automation so that it's actually using that instead. So before we go anywhere, let's look at the automation we've got set up, and it's in workflows, and it's donuts test 1. We'll just run that, and you can see that we have the values we'd expect. And if I was to look at the source of this document, we'd also have the IDs sat as the value. Sorry, these are the name keys. And if we looked at the source, we'd see that we had the ID sat as the value key in this control. So that's all working. So let's change that now. And we'll go and create another option list. And we'll call this one, oops, donut simple, and the source URL is donuts. Real time we'll leave on, even though it is cached. We do need to ignore SSL because de jure runs with a self-signed certificate, which would give errors otherwise. And you can see down here, this is where we would normally write our complex translation script. Well, we don't need that now, so we can save changes. Donuts, potentially. That's me. Yeah. Of course. Sorry about that. So we've saved down the option list. And we can now go to the input that uses that option list. We can edit that to use donuts and change it to donuts simple. And then we'll go back to our automation and workflow, and we'll execute this again. And you can see we've got exactly the same data available to us, but we didn't have to write any of that JavaScript in order to extract it. So that is Switch, essentially. It's a fairly edge case. However, unless you have experience with JavaScript, sometimes writing those translation scripts is not the easiest. So at best, Switch eliminates the need for that translation script whilst maintaining refreshed data for you. So it's not like you have to go and save the file, process it, and repeat that manually. This is an automated process, provided you can host it somewhere, and I'd recommend this de jure server for that. But even if you had to then start using more complex scripts that use dependent inputs, even those scripts would be massively simplified because of the way that this works, and it doesn't require an initial translation script. The actual scripting piece would be much simpler because of that. So that's it, that's switch, and I hope it's useful.